Imagine a nation that believed its pantry was unassailable, waking up one morning to find the shelves emptied. Not by drought, not by missiles, but by a quiet, coordinated refusal from across an ocean. That is the story we are living through, and it begins with a single sentence of disbelief that should startle every American who still equates power with privilege. Picture Washington's polished halls buzzing with a new kind of panic. Grain silos are overflowing, and markets that once seemed permanent are suddenly wobbling. The shock isn't just economic, it's historic. What has happened is a reversal of a centuries-old arrangement where raw materials flowed one way and finished wealth flowed the other. Now, the map has been redrawn. This isn't a parable. It is the account of a continent that chose to stop being the world's best grocery store and instead built its own kitchens, factories, and trading floors. In a decisive collective move, African governments and agrarian coalitions froze imports. They rejected over $120 billion in agricultural goods that had long moved from American heartland fields to African markets. The images are almost cinematic. Freighter manifests stamped, denied, ports retooled overnight into hubs of regional trade. Markets in Lagos, Accra, and Nairobi are filling with homegrown bags of flour and sacks of maize, processed by factories bearing African flags rather than foreign logos. For generations, the pattern was predictable. Subsidized exports from the United States undercut local producers. Young farmers left the land because cheap imports made cultivation unprofitable, and entire rural economies hollowed out. But the new narrative flips that script. What began as a whispered strategy in back rooms became a continent-wide plan built on technology, investment, and a willingness to insist on industrial parity instead of charity. Solar irrigation now rings the Sahel, drones map fields in the Nile Basin, and AI algorithms optimize planting schedules. Regional grain reserves stabilize prices, acting like shock absorbers so this transition doesn't turn into chaos. These developments didn't arrive by accident. They were the product of years of covert coordination among ministers, agronomists, and diaspora investors who refused the old terms of trade. They bargained for processing plants, for local ownership, for commitments to train workers, and for technology transfer, not just temporary capital. The result was a strategy of economic sovereignty that was both strategic and surgical. When imports were frozen, the world saw only a blockade. But Africans saw a deadline to prove their models worked. Within weeks, ports that had received American grain for decades were repurposed. Grain elevators were upgraded, cold chains extended, and new commodity exchanges appeared that could settle trades without routing every payment through traditional Western banking rails. Partners from Asia, Latin America, and the Gulf provided markets and investment without the political sermons. Those relationships mattered because they offered real trade on acceptable terms. The impact in the United States was immediate and visceral. Farmers who had trusted decades of demand suddenly watched prices plunge as their buyers vanished. Corporate trading desks saw billions in contracts evaporate. Freight companies scrambled to rebook cargo. Politicians from both parties convened emergency hearings, promised bailouts, and scrambled through tired playbooks, expecting trade to bend to diplomatic pressure. But that pressure didn't break the coalition. African leaders had planned for this. They had contingency lines with Brazil and India, swap arrangements with China, and sovereign wealth partners from the Gulf ready to finance infrastructure. The old leverage the West relied upon monetary dominance and blunt political pressure was less effective in a multipolar market where profit incentives matter more than rhetorical threats. This wasn't simply retaliation. It was a conscious pivot to build an integrated agroindustrial continent that can feed itself, add value to its raw crops, and export processed goods on its own terms. Think of the political psychology at work. For decades, the message many African farmers received was that their only path to survival was to accept foreign grain. The new message asserted the opposite. Feed your people, build factories, create jobs, and demand that partners invest in your soil, your mills, and your people. That ideological shift turned policy into purpose and profitability. The economics are both simple and profound. Processing crops domestically captures value that would otherwise leave the continent. It creates employment across entire value chains, from logistics to branding. And it stabilizes rural incomes so young people see a future at home instead of in perilous migration. The political payoff is just as potent. A continent that feeds itself has bargaining power, and bargaining power reshapes alliances. Markets recalibrated. Asian buyers who once negotiated with U.S. suppliers began signing long-term deals with African conglomerates. Shipping lines signed leases at African ports for new hub strategies, and a new digital commodity exchange enabled the rapid rerouting of surplus stocks to hungry buyers. That's why analysts who call this move economic hostility are missing the point. For many African leaders and citizens, it's liberation. They aren't trying to break economies for pain's sake. They're trying to build durable prosperity that doesn't require permission. And for Americans like John Bartman, the soybean farmer in Illinois, whose family tilled the same fields for generations, this is a personal catastrophe and a wake-up call rolled into one. He stands with a yield monitor that still counts bushels but no longer guarantees buyers. He is emblematic of an urgent policy dilemma. How do you protect livelihoods in the short run while rebuilding an economy to compete in the long run? The answers aren't simple or quick, but they are unavoidable. Policymakers must move beyond firefighting to structural transformation. This crisis reveals a larger geopolitical lesson. Influence isn't sustained by paternalistic aid or subsidized exports. It's maintained by being a partner that builds capacity and shares ownership. The continent's pivot also exposed internal asymmetries. Countries that had invested earlier in ports, power, and governance scaled faster and became early winners. Others needed support, and a coordinated mechanism redistributed investment to prevent fragmentation. That intracontinental solidarity was part of the plan, and it made the blockade a strategic maneuver rather than a purely symbolic act. Critics warned of humanitarian consequences and called the move reckless. But the reality on the ground was startlingly different. Where processing and storage capacity increased, food insecurity fell, rural incomes rose, and the need for ad hoc food aid declined. Local markets stabilized because surpluses could be held in reserves and mobilized to meet shortfalls. The ripple effects reached international institutions. Washington found that isolation was ineffective when other partners offered practical alternatives without political strings. The World Bank and IMF saw their conditional models challenged by investors willing to finance projects with fewer preconditions. This is the anatomy of a new multipolar economic order, where trade is negotiated through mutual opportunity. So understand where we are headed. The blockade might have been the spark, but the real change is structural. Grain that once shipped from the American Midwest now leaves from African ports that have become dynamic processing hubs. Supermarkets across the continent now display regional brands processed locally. Youth who once sought their futures abroad are finding careers in agro-tech startups. And perhaps most consequential, African leaders began to treat food policy as national security, with the same urgency as energy or minerals. If you've stayed with me to this point, you're already doing what most people can no longer do in a world of constant distraction. You refocused, you're attentive, and you're thinking. Know this about the channel you're watching. Every video we produce is grounded in real information, deep research, and verified facts. And this story is no exception. So what comes next is not mere conjecture. Expect competition for export markets to intensify. Expect financial settlement mechanisms to diversify away from a single dominant currency. Expect global supply chains to be rerouted. And expect the United States to face a strategic choice: adapt and partner on equitable terms, or try to coerce and watch its influence slip further as others fill the vacuum. Before I sign off, there's an important announcement. We're relaunching an in-depth Q&A session soon where I'll answer your questions about this crisis, the geopolitical shifts involved, and what it means for all of us. Post your questions in the comments now, and I'll tackle them in the next live episode. If this analysis sharpened your understanding and you want to stay informed as this story evolves, like this video. Share it with someone who still thinks geopolitics is abstract. And subscribe for weekly deep dives that cut past the headlines and explain what really matters.